Colorado Territory, September 1878. The autumn wind howled through Shadow Valley like the voices of restless spirits, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. Caleb Stone's ranch house stood defiant against the elements, its weathered logs bearing the scars of 15 years battling nature's fury. Smoke curled from the stone chimney into the gray sky, the only sign of life in a landscape that seemed abandoned by God himself. Caleb worked alone in his barn, repairing a broken wagon wheel with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that survival depended on attention to detail. At 44, his body bore the marks of a hard life, hands scarred by barbed wire, shoulders bent from hauling timber, and eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen too much violence. His dark hair, now streaked with premature silver, fell across his forehead as he bent to his work.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of some of the most unforgiving land in Colorado Territory. Other settlers had tried to claim pieces of Shadow Valley over the years, but the combination of harsh winters, unpredictable springs, and the looming presence of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains had driven them all away. Only Caleb remained, stubborn. As the granite peaks that surrounded his domain, Caleb hadn't always been a hermit. 15 years ago, he'd been Sergeant Caleb Stone of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, a decorated soldier who'd served with distinction in the Indian Wars. His unit had been responsible for protecting wagon trains and surveying new territories for the railroad companies that were pushing westward with relentless determination. The nightmare that changed everything happened on a bitter February morning in 1863. Captain Marcus de la Croix had received orders to investigate reports of hostile Cheyenne activity near Bent's Creek. The intelligence was wrong or deliberately falsified. Instead of warriors, they found a peaceful village of families wintering in the protected valley. Caleb's commanding officer, drunk on whiskey and ambition, had given the order to attack anyway. "Indians are Indians," Delacroix had snarled. "Dead ones can't raid our settlements." The massacre that followed haunted Caleb's dreams for years. Women, children, elderly men who couldn't defend themselves, all cut down by soldiers who were supposed to protect the innocent. Caleb had tried to stop it, turning his rifle on his own commanding officer in a desperate attempt to end the slaughter. The bullet meant for Delacroix had instead struck a young Cheyenne woman who was trying to shield her infant son. Her blood had stained the snow red, and her accusing eyes had burned themselves into Caleb's memory. The military tribunal that followed cleared Caleb of charges, declaring his actions the result of temporary battlefield confusion. But Caleb knew the truth. He was a killer, no different from the men who had murdered innocents under orders. He'd resigned his commission, taken his savings, and fled to the most isolated place he could find. Shadow Valley had become Caleb's penance. He raised a small herd of cattle, enough to sustain himself, but never enough to prosper. He traded rarely with the settlement of Clearwater Falls, 20 miles east, making the journey only when his supplies ran dangerously low. The townspeople knew him as a taciturn man who paid his debts and caused no trouble. His only companions were his animals and the letters he wrote but never sent. Dozens of them filled a wooden crate in his bedroom, apologies to the families of those who had died at Bent's Creek, explanations to his sister back in Missouri, who still wondered why he'd never returned home, confessions to God that he hoped might someday earn him forgiveness. The ranch house itself reflected Caleb's isolation. Built with his own hands from timber cut in the surrounding mountains, it was functional but sparse. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. No decorations adorned the walls, except for a faded photograph of his parents and a cavalry saber that he'd never touched since hanging it there. Caleb's daily routine rarely varied. Dawn brought chores, feeding the cattle, checking fences, maintaining equipment. Afternoon was for the heavier work, cutting firewood, repairing buildings, preparing for winter. Evening found him reading by firelight, working his way through the same dozen books again and again. He owned a Bible, though he wasn't sure he still believed, and a collection of poetry that reminded him of better times. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening in late September. Caleb was finishing his supper when a sound echoed across the valley, a sound that had no place in the wilderness symphony he knew so well. It was rhythmic, metallic, like chains dragging across stone. Caleb froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. In 15 years of living in Shadow Valley, he'd learned to identify every natural sound, the call of mountain lions, the rustle of elk moving through timber, the crack of trees adjusting to temperature changes. This was something else entirely. He set down his plate and moved to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. The sound came again, fainter this time, seeming to originate from the direction of Devil's Backbone, a jagged ridge of limestone cliffs that formed the northern boundary of his property. Devil's Backbone was honeycombed with caves, some shallow, others extending deep into the mountain's heart. Caleb had explored a few of them over the years, mostly out of curiosity, but many remained unmapped and dangerous. The largest cave, known locally as Judgment Cavern, was home to thousands of bats that emerged each evening in a dark cloud visible. For miles, the metallic sound persisted for nearly an hour before finally fading into silence. Caleb remained at his window long after it stopped, uneasiness settling in his stomach like a cold stone. In all his years in the valley, nothing had disturbed the natural order so dramatically. The sounds returned the following evening, louder and more prolonged. This time Caleb was ready. He'd spent the day checking his weapons, a Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver, and a razor-sharp hunting knife that had been his father's. Whatever was making those sounds he intended to investigate. As darkness fell, Caleb saddled his horse Thunder, a sturdy bay gelding that had been his companion for 8 years. Thunder was sure-footed in difficult terrain and possessed the calm temperament necessary for a man who often rode alone through dangerous country. The ride to Devil's Backbone took 40 minutes across rough terrain. Caleb followed game trails and his own intimate knowledge of the land, avoiding the loose shale that could cripple a horse and the hidden ravines that appeared without warning in the darkness. The sounds grew clearer as he approached the limestone cliffs, definitely chains, and something else, a voice, barely audible, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Human speech, but not English. The realization sent ice through Caleb's veins. Someone was up there, in the caves, and they were clearly in distress. Caleb dismounted at the base of the cliffs and began the treacherous climb toward Judgment Cavern. The rock face was treacherous in daylight and potentially lethal in darkness, but the sounds were growing more urgent. Someone needed help, and despite his desire for isolation, Caleb couldn't ignore a soul in distress. The mouth of Judgment Cavern yawned before him like the gates of hell. Caleb had been inside before, but never at night when thousands of bats called it home. The air thrummed with the sound of wings and the chittering of the creatures disturbed by his presence. Caleb lit a coal oil lantern and stepped into the cave's mouth. The metallic sounds were much clearer now, echoing off the stone walls with haunting resonance. Following the sound deeper into the cavern, Caleb navigated around massive stalagmites and avoided the treacherous pools of water that collected in the cave's natural depressions. The cavern branched into multiple passages, but the sounds were coming from the largest chamber, a cathedral-like space where the bats roosted during daylight hours. As Caleb rounded a bend in the passage, his lantern light fell upon a sight that stopped him cold. Chained to the cavern wall was a young Native American woman, her wrists and ankles bound with iron shackles that had been driven deep into the limestone with iron spikes. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with long black hair that fell past her shoulders and intelligent dark eyes that reflected his lantern light with startling intensity. Her clothing identified her as Pawnee intricate beadwork.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
On her buckskin dress, silver ornaments in her hair, and moccasins decorated with patterns Caleb recognized from his military days. But her appearance told a story of suffering. Her dress was torn, her face bore the marks of violence, and dried blood stained the shackles around her wrists. "My God," Caleb whispered, setting down his lantern and approaching slowly. "Who did this to you?" The woman's eyes tracked his movement with wariness, but she didn't try to speak. Up close, Caleb could see that her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and her skin had the gray pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in days. Caleb knelt beside her, examining the shackles. They were professionally made, the kind used to transport prisoners across long distances. Heavy iron bands with locks that would require either a key or substantial tools to remove. Whoever had done this had planned it carefully. "I'm going to get you out of here," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure she understood English. "My name is Caleb. I'm not going to hurt you." The woman's lips moved, and a single word emerged in a voice barely above a whisper. "Nitawa." Caleb spent precious minutes examining the shackles, looking for any weakness in their construction. The iron was solid, and the lock showed no signs of rust or damage that might make them easier to break. He would need proper tools, a file. Or better yet, a hacksaw. "I have to go back to my ranch," he told Natawa, though he suspected she didn't understand. "I'll bring tools, food and water. I'll be back before dawn, I promise." Natawa's eyes widened with what might have been panic. She spoke rapidly in Pawnee, her voice urgent and fearful. Though Caleb couldn't understand the words, her meaning was clear. She was terrified of being left alone. Caleb removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders, then pulled a small flask from his pocket. Water had never been more precious than at this moment. He held it to her lips, supporting her head as she drank gratefully. "I'll be back," he repeated, touching her shoulder gently. "I give you my word." The ride back to the ranch was the longest 40 minutes of Caleb's life. Questions churned in his mind like a spring storm. Who had chained Natawa in the cave? Why had they chosen such a remote location? How long had she been there? And most urgently, were her captors still nearby? Back at his ranch, Caleb worked by lamplight to gather everything he would need. His toolbox yielded a hacksaw, files, and a small sledgehammer that might be useful for driving out the spikes. He packed food jerky, hardtack, and a jar of preserved peaches that would provide quick energy. More importantly, he prepared for potential violence. Caleb loaded his Winchester and filled his pockets with ammunition. If Natawa's captors were still in the area, they wouldn't give up their prisoner without a fight. As he worked, Caleb found himself thinking about the young woman chained in the cave. Her eyes had held intelligence and strength despite her ordeal. She was a fighter, someone who had endured unimaginable suffering but hadn't broken. The thought of her alone in the darkness with the bats made his stomach churn. He also thought about the implications of his discovery. Native Americans in this region were supposed to be on reservations hundreds of miles away. The presence of a Pawnee woman in Shadow Valley suggested something was seriously wrong. Either she had escaped from official custody, or someone had taken her illegally. Caleb made the return journey in record time, pushing thunder harder than he usually dared in the darkness. The urgency in Natawa's eyes haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The climb back up to the cavern seemed even more treacherous with a heavy pack of tools, but adrenaline gave Caleb strength he didn't know he possessed. The bats were more active now, streaming out of the cave in preparation for their nightly hunt. Their wing beats created a sound like distant thunder inside the cavern. Caleb found Natawa exactly as he'd left her, though she seemed even weaker. Her head lolled against the stone wall, and her breathing was shallow. The sight filled him with rage, not the hot anger of battle. but the cold fury of a man confronting deliberate cruelty. "I'm back," he said softly, kneeling beside her with his tools. "I'm going to get these chains off." Natawa's eyes opened, focusing on him with what might have been relief. She spoke again in Pawnee, her voice stronger than before. Though he couldn't understand her words, her tone conveyed gratitude and hope. Removing the shackles proved more challenging than Caleb had anticipated. The iron was thick and the locks were well made. He started with the hacksaw, working at the chain between her ankles while she watched with growing alertness. The work was slow, and the saw blade grew hot from friction against the iron. Caleb had to stop frequently to let it cool, during which time he gave Natawa small sips of water and pieces of softened hardtack. Color was slowly returning to her face. "Your name is Natawa," Caleb said as he worked, more to fill the silence than from any expectation of conversation. "Mine is Caleb Stone. I live alone in this valley, have for 15 years. To his surprise, Natawa responded in halting English. "You are soldier," she said, studying his face carefully. Caleb's hand stilled on the hacksaw. "Was a soldier," he corrected. "Long time ago. How do you know?" "Your eyes," she said simply. "Same as other soldiers. Carry ghosts." The observation hit Caleb like a physical blow. This young woman, chained in a cave and tortured by unknown captors, had somehow seen straight through to his deepest shame. Her perception was both unsettling and strangely comforting. "Yes," he admitted, "I carry ghosts. Too many of them." Natawa nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Good ghosts or bad ghosts?" Caleb considered the question as he resumed sawing. "Bad ones mostly. People I couldn't save. People I hurt when I should have protected them." "Then you understand," Natawa said, and something in her voice suggested she carried her own burden of ghosts. After 2 hours of patient work, the ankle chain finally parted with a sharp crack that echoed through the cavern. Natawa flexed her feet, wincing as circulation returned to her lower legs. The shackles around her wrists proved even more stubborn, requiring Caleb to use the files to weaken the metal before the hacksaw could finish the job. When the last chain fell away, Natawa slumped forward, her body finally free after what must have been days of immobilization. Caleb caught her before she could fall, feeling how light she was, how weakened by her ordeal. "Can you walk?" he asked, supporting her weight as she tried to stand. Natawa nodded, though her first few steps were unsteady. "Must leave," she said urgently, grasping his arm. "They will return with sunrise." "Who?" Caleb demanded. "Who did this to you?" "Bad white men," Natawa replied, her English becoming more fluid as strength returned. "They take Pawnee people from reservation, sell to mine owners for work slaves." The revelation hit Caleb like a sledgehammer. Slave traders, operating in the territories where law enforcement was thin and corruption was common. It explained the professional quality of the shackles and the remote location of the cave. "How many men?" Caleb asked as they made their way carefully toward the cave entrance. "6, Natawa replied. "Led by man with yellow beard and scar across face. They call him Kruger." Caleb filed the name away for future reference. If these men were operating in his territory, capturing and enslaving Native Americans, they would have to be stopped. But first, he had to get Natawa to safety. The journey down from the cavern was treacherous with Natawa in her weakened condition, but her determination was remarkable. She gritted her teeth against the pain and moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. Thunder waited patiently at the base of the cliffs, and Caleb helped Natawa mount behind him. Her arms around his waist were thin, but surprisingly strong, and he could feel her scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. "Where are your people?" Caleb asked as they began the ride back to his ranch. "Coming," Natawa replied, and something in her voice suggested this was both a promise and a warning. The ride back to Caleb's ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of thunder's hooves against the rocky ground, and the occasional rustle of wind through the pine trees. Natawa's grip around Caleb's waist tightened whenever they passed through particularly dark patches of forest, her body trembling not just from cold, but from the lingering terror of her ordeal. As they approached the ranch house, Caleb felt the familiar weight of isolation that had defined his life for 15 years. The simple log structure had been his fortress against the world, a place where he could hide from his past and the ghosts that haunted him. Now, for the first time since he'd built it, he was bringing another human being into his sanctuary. Caleb helped Natawa dismount, steadying her as her legs threatened to give way. The moonlight revealed the full extent of her injuries, deep bruises around her wrists where the shackles had bitten into her skin, a cut on her left cheek that had scabbed over, and the hollow look of someone who had been starved and terrorized. "You're safe now," Caleb said softly, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. If Kruger and his men were still in the area, his isolated ranch might be more trap than sanctuary. Inside the ranch house, Caleb quickly built up the fire in the stone fireplace, filling the main room with warmth and flickering light. Natawa stood uncertainly in the doorway, her dark eyes taking in the sparse furnishings and the masculine disorder of a man who had lived alone for too long. "Sit," Caleb said, gesturing to the leather chair closest to the fire. "I'll get you some proper food." Natawa moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to conserve energy during captivity. She settled into the chair, pulling Caleb's coat tight around her shoulders, and watched him move about the small kitchen with the wariness of a wild animal that had been caged. As Caleb prepared a meal of beans, salt pork, and cornbread, Natawa began to speak in her halting English. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the cadence of someone who had learned the white man's language out of necessity rather than choice. "My people live on reservation in Indian Territory," she said, staring into the fire. "Government men say we must stay there, learn white ways, forget old ways. But land is bad, food is little, children get sick and die." Caleb set a plate of food before her, noting how her hands shook as she lifted the fork. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if it might be her last. "Some of our young men, they get angry," Natawa continued. "They want to leave reservation, go back to old hunting grounds. Government sends soldiers to stop them, but soldiers cannot watch everyone all the time." "You tried to leave," Caleb said, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. Natawa nodded, a flash of defiance crossing her features. "My brother Dakota, he was sick from bad water on reservation. Medicine man said he needed herbs that grow only in sacred places far from white man's fences. I went with him to find healing plants." She paused, her fork hovering over her plate as painful memories surfaced. "We were careful, traveled only at night, avoided roads and settlements. But these men, they had been watching reservation, waiting for people like us. Kruger's men," Caleb said grimly. "Yes, they follow us for 3 days before they strike. My brother, he fought them, but they had guns and we had only knives. They shot him, left him to die in the mountains." Natawa's voice broke slightly, but she continued. "They took me because young woman is worth more money to mine owners than wounded man." Caleb felt sick as the full scope of the criminal enterprise became clear. "How many others?" he asked. "In cave I was alone," Natawa replied, "but I heard them talking. They have other places, other caves, where they keep people before selling them. Some Pawnee, some Cherokee, some Apache. Anyone who leaves reservation becomes target." She described an organized network of slavers who preyed on Native Americans, attempting to escape the confines of government reservations. The criminals had contacts among corrupt Indian agents, mining companies desperate for cheap labor, and territorial officials who turned a blind eye to human trafficking in exchange for bribes. "They chain people in caves until buyers come," Natawa explained. Caves are hidden, hard to find, and screams cannot be heard. Some people, they are sold to mines and mountains. Others go to railroad camps or big ranches where owners ask no questions about workers. And if someone can't work, Caleb asked, though he dreaded the answer, then they are left to die, Nitawa said simply. Kruger, he told me this when I first fought him. Said I could work or I could become food for mountain animals. As Nitawa spoke, Caleb felt a familiar fire building in his chest, the same cold fury that had driven him to turn his rifle on his commanding officer at Bent's Creek. The difference was that this time, his anger was righteous rather than desperate. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Kruger and his men were probably planning their next move, treating human beings like livestock to be bought and sold. The thought made his hands clench into fists. You said your brother was wounded, Caleb said, turning back to face her. Do you know if he survived? Nitawa shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. I heard no more shooting after they took me. But Dakota is strong, and he knows mountains well. If Great Spirit wills it, he may yet live, and your people on the reservation? Do they know you're missing? By now, yes, Nitawa replied with certainty. When we did not return, our Uncle Chief Spotted Eagle would send search parties. But they look for us in sacred places, not in white man's caves. Caleb returned to his chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You said they would return with sunrise. How many men and what weapons? Nitawa closed her eyes, apparently visualizing her captors. 6 men total. Kruger has yellow beard and scar from knife fight. He carries 2 pistols and sharp knife. His second man, they call him Dutch, is very big and strong, uses club with iron spikes. She continued describing the rest of the gang, a thin man named Coyote, who is skilled with rifle. Twin brothers called the Maddox boys who specialized in tracking, and a young man named Pike who seemed to enjoy causing pain. They have good horses, good weapons, and they know this country well, Nitawa warned. This is not first time they hunt in these mountains. Caleb nodded grimly. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he had advantages of his own. This was his land, his territory, and he knew every rock, tree, and game trail for miles around. More importantly, he had something worth fighting for. We need to assume they'll track us here, he said. The question is whether we run or make a stand. Cannot run, Nitawa said firmly. I am too weak for long journey, and your horse cannot carry both of us fast enough. Better to fight here, where you know ground. Caleb spent the next hour preparing his ranch for siege. He moved ammunition to strategic locations, positioned water buckets near doors and windows in case of fire, and checked the sturdy shutters he'd built to protect against winter storms. The ranch house itself was well positioned defensively. Built into a natural depression with a rocky outcropping at its back, it was difficult to approach from 3 sides. The front faced an open meadow that would force attackers to cross nearly 100 yards of open ground to reach the building. While Caleb worked, Nitawa surprised him by helping despite her weakened condition. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to preparing for violence, checking weapons and organizing supplies with practiced skill. You have done this before, Caleb observed as she cleaned his spare revolver with competent hands. Pawnee women are taught to fight, she replied matter-of-factly. Reservation life does not change this. We know that sometimes running is not possible, and white man's law does not protect us. As they worked, Caleb found himself studying this remarkable woman who had endured so much yet remained unbroken. Her resilience reminded him of the Cheyenne woman he had failed to save at Bent's Creek. But where that memory brought guilt, Nitawa's strength brought something like hope. With their preparations complete, Caleb and Nitawa settled in to wait for dawn. Caleb positioned himself at the front window with his Winchester, while Nitawa watched the back approach with a loaded revolver. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the distant howl of wolves and the occasional creak of settling timber. During the long watch, their conversation turned to more personal matters. Natawa spoke of her childhood before the reservation, when her people still followed the buffalo herds and lived according to ancient traditions. Her voice carried a mixture of longing and loss as she described a world that had been destroyed by the westward expansion of white civilization. My grandfather, he was war chief, she said softly. He fought many battles against other tribes, against white soldiers, always to protect our people. He taught me that sometimes violence is necessary, but it must have purpose beyond anger. Caleb understood. His own violence at Bent's Creek had been purposeless, born of rage and confusion rather than protection. What would your grandfather say about fighting these slavers? He would say that protecting the innocent is always worthy cause, Nitoa replied. But he would also say that wise warrior chooses battles carefully, because dead hero cannot save anyone. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the eastern mountains, Caleb spotted movement in the tree line at the edge of his property. A brief flash of color that didn't belong, the red flannel shirt of a man trying to stay hidden. They're here, he whispered to Natoa, who immediately moved to her assigned position. Through his spyglass, Caleb could see them, positioning themselves for an assault. Kruger had split his men into two groups. 3 would approach from the front, while the other 3 circled around to attack from the sides. It was a sound tactical plan that would have worked against most opponents, but Caleb had spent 15 years learning every inch of his property, including the natural obstacles that would channel approaching enemies into predetermined killing zones. The rocky outcropping behind his house wasn't just defensive. It was the mouth of a narrow canyon that would funnel attackers into a crossfire. Remember, he told Natawa, don't shoot until I give the signal. We need to let them get close. Enough that they can't retreat easily. She nodded, her dark eyes hard with determination. I am ready. Kruger's voice boomed across the meadow as the sun finally cleared the mountain peaks. Stone, we know you're in there. Send out the squaw and we'll let you live. Caleb didn't respond immediately, using his spyglass to get a better look at the man who had tortured Natawa. Kruger was exactly as she had described, tall and broad-shouldered, with a yellow beard and a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. His eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of a man who had killed often and felt nothing. You hear me, Stone? Kruger called again. That Indian girl is valuable property. You interfere with our business, you make yourself our enemy. This time Caleb answered, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. She's not property. Kruger, she's a human being, and she's under my protection. Kruger's laugh was harsh and without humor. Your protection? Old man, you don't know who you're dealing with. We've killed better men than you for less reason. Then you'd better bring more men, Caleb replied, and he heard Natawa's sharp intake of breath at his boldness. Kruger's response was swift and violent. The 3 men in the tree line opened fire simultaneously, their bullets splintering the wooden shutters and sending shards of glass flying from the windows. Caleb had expected this and was already below the windowsill, counting shots and waiting for the pause that would indicate they were reloading. The attackers from the sides moved at the same time, using the covering fire to advance toward the ranch house. But Caleb had prepared for this too. As the first man rounded the corner of the building, he ran directly into a carefully placed bear trap that Caleb had positioned and camouflaged the night before. The man's scream echoed across the valley as the steel jaws closed on his leg, the sound cutting through the gunfire like a knife. His cries alerted the other attackers to the danger, but also revealed their positions to the defenders. Now! Caleb shouted, and he and Natawa opened fire simultaneously. Caleb's first shot took down the thin man called Coyote, the bullet catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around. Natawa's shot was even better, her bullet finding its mark in the chest of one of the Maddox brothers. The man fell backward, his rifle clattering against the rocks. The sudden reversal of fortune enraged Kruger, who had expected to overwhelm a single rancher with ease. His remaining men were now pinned down by accurate fire from defenders, who clearly knew what they were doing. Burn them out! Kruger roared, and Caleb saw the young man called Pike producing a bottle of coal oil and a burning torch, but as Pike prepared to throw his improvised firebomb, something unexpected happened. An arrow appeared in his chest as if by magic, the fletching quivering with the impact. The man looked down in shock before collapsing to the ground. From the tree line came a sound that made both Caleb and Natoa freeze, the distinctive war cry of Pawnee warriors. The search party had found them at last, and they had arrived at exactly the right moment. What followed was chaos. Kruger's men, caught between the ranch house and the trees, suddenly found themselves under attack from two directions. The Pawnee warriors moved like shadows, using the terrain and their superior knowledge of forest fighting to devastating effect. Caleb watched in amazement as painted warriors seemed to materialize from the very ground, their traditional weapons proving devastatingly effective against men who had relied too heavily on firearms. The survivor of the Maddox brothers fell to a war club, while Dutch, the large man with the spiked club, found himself facing two warriors armed with tomahawks. Only Kruger himself remained, and he was trapped in the open meadow with nowhere to run. The yellow-bearded slaver fired wildly at the approaching warriors, his shots going wide as panic overcame his usual deadly accuracy. Natawa stood up from her position, her voice carrying across the battlefield in fluent Pawnee. She was calling to the warriors, and though Caleb couldn't understand the words, their effect was immediate. The warriors stopped their advance, forming a circle around Kruger, but not closing in for the kill. "What did you tell them?" Caleb asked as the shooting died away. "That this one must face judgment from our chief." Natawa replied, her eyes never leaving Kruger's face. "Some crimes are too great for quick death." From the forest emerged a figure that commanded instant respect, Chief Spotted Eagle, war leader of the Pawnee and Natawa's uncle. He was a man in his 50s, tall and lean with silver-streaked hair braided with eagle feathers and bear claws. His weathered face bore the ritual scars of a warrior who had earned his position through countless battles, and his dark eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the old ways and the new world that was destroying them. Behind him came 12 warriors, each painted for war with symbols that told the story of their deeds. They moved with the fluid grace of men who had learned to hunt and fight in terrain that would challenge even the most experienced white soldiers. Their weapons were a mixture of traditional tomahawks and war clubs alongside modern rifles they had acquired through trade or taken from defeated enemies. Chief Spotted Eagle surveyed the scene with the calm assessment of a military commander. His gaze took in Kruger cowering in the meadow, the bodies of the slavers scattered across Caleb's property, and finally settled on his niece standing beside the white rancher who had saved her life. "Natawa," he said in English, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command, "you are safe now. Your brother Dakota lives. He crawled to our hunting camp with news of your capture. We have been tracking these white devils for 4 days." Natawa's relief was visible as tears streamed down her face. She had feared the worst about her brother's fate, and learning he had survived the attack lifted a weight from her shoulders that had been crushing her spirit. Chief Spotted Eagle turned his attention to Caleb, studying the rancher with the same intensity he had applied to the battlefield. "You are the one who freed my sister's daughter from the cave of bats," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," Caleb replied, meeting the chief's gaze without flinching. "I couldn't leave her there to die. Many white men would have turned away," the chief observed. "Or worse, they would have taken advantage of her helplessness. Why did you risk your life for a stranger?" Caleb considered the question carefully. "Because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil. I've been that person who did nothing, and I won't be him again." Chief Spotted Eagle nodded slowly, as if Caleb's answer confirmed something he had suspected. He then turned his attention to Kruger, who was now kneeling in the meadow with his hands raised in surrender. The yellow-bearded slaver's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate fear of a man who knew he was facing death. "You are the one they call Kruger," the chief said, his voice carrying the weight of accusation. "You steal our people, chain them like animals, sell them to work in mines until they die. You have committed crimes against the Great Spirit and against the natural order." Kruger tried to speak, his voice cracking with terror. "I was just following orders. The mining companies, they pay good money for workers. It ain't personal. Just business." "Business," Chief Spotted Eagle repeated the word as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. "You speak of human souls as if they were cattle to be bought and sold. There is no honor in such business. No place for such men in the world the Great Spirit created." The chief gestured to his warriors, who moved forward to bind Kruger's hands with rawhide cords. "You will be taken to our council fire, where the elders will decide your fate. But first, you will tell us about the other caves, the other people you have stolen, and the white men who buy from you." Kruger's eyes darted frantically between the warriors surrounding him. "I'll tell you everything. Names, places, all of it. Just don't let them torture me. The torture you fear is nothing compared to what you have done to innocent people," Chief Spotted Eagle replied coldly. "But if you speak truth, perhaps your death will be quick." As the warriors prepared to remove Kruger and the surviving slavers, Caleb made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Wait," he called out, stepping forward. "I want to come with you." Chief Spotted Eagle raised an eyebrow. "You wish to attend our council fire?" "This is not white man's law, but the justice of the Pawnee people." "I know," Caleb replied. "But these men were operating on my land using my territory as their hunting ground. They've made me part of this whether I wanted to be or not. I need to see this through to the end." More than that, Caleb realized he needed to understand the full scope of what Kruger and his gang had been doing. The isolated rancher who had tried to hide from the world's problems could no longer pretend that evil would leave him alone if he simply ignored it. Natawa stepped forward, placing a hand on Caleb's arm. "Uncle, this man saved my life and fought beside me against our enemies. He has earned the right to witness justice." Chief Spotted Eagle considered this request for a long moment. "You understand that our ways are not your ways? That what you see may be difficult for a white man to accept." "I've seen difficult things before," Caleb replied. "I've also done difficult things. I'm not afraid of your justice. I'm afraid of what happens if men like Kruger face no justice at all." The war party departed Caleb's ranch as the sun reached its zenith, traveling through mountain passes and hidden valleys that the rancher had never seen despite living in the area for 15 years. The Pawnee moved with the efficiency of people who had been forced to become nomadic, their temporary camp positioned in a natural fortress that would be nearly impossible for enemies to assault. Caleb rode alongside Natawa, both of them mounted on horses provided by the war party. Thunder had been left at the ranch to rest, and Caleb found himself on an unfamiliar mount-a-paint horse with intelligent eyes and a smooth gait that spoke of careful breeding and training. "This was my brother's horse," Natawa explained, patting the animal's neck. "Star Runner. He will carry you safely." As they traveled, Caleb learned more about the scope of Kruger's operation. The slavers had been active for nearly 2 years, preying on Native Americans from multiple tribes who attempted to leave their assigned reservations. They had established a network of caves and hidden camps throughout the territory, using the isolation of the mountains to conduct their business away from the eyes of law enforcement. "The white authorities know," Chief Spotted Eagle said grimly as they rode. "Some are paid to look the other way. Others simply do not care what happens to redskins who break the law by leaving their reservations." The corruption extended deeper than Caleb had imagined. Indian agents who were supposed to protect their charges instead provided information about potential escapees. Territorial judges accepted bribes to ignore evidence of slavery. Even some military commanders had been compromised, providing unofficial protection for the slavers' operations. The Pawnee camp was a marvel of efficiency and organization. Dozens of tipis arranged in careful patterns, with the largest and most ornate structure at the center where Chief Spotted Eagle held council. Children played between the dwellings while women worked at various tasks preparing food, tending horses, crafting weapons and tools. What struck Caleb most was the sense of community and purpose that permeated the camp. These people had been driven from their ancestral lands and forced onto reservations, but they had not allowed their spirits to be broken. They maintained their traditions, their dignity, and their determination to survive as a people. Natoa's return was celebrated with a mixture of joy and solemn ceremony. Family members embraced her with tears of relief, while the warriors who had rescued her were honored for their courage and skill. Caleb found himself included in these celebrations, treated as a warrior who had proven himself in battle. "You fought beside us," explained a young warrior named Swift Arrow. "You protected our sister when she needed protection. This makes you our brother in war." The concept of brotherhood earned through shared combat was something Caleb understood from his military days. But the Pawnee version felt different, more personal, more meaningful than the casual camaraderie he had known among soldiers. As evening approached, Chief Spotted Eagle called for the council fire to be lit. The entire camp gathered in a circle around the flames, with the elders taking positions of honor closest to the fire. Kruger and the surviving slavers were brought forward, their hands bound and their faces showing the strain of knowing they faced judgment from people they had wronged. The ceremony began with prayers in the Pawnee language, spoken by an elderly medicine man whose voice carried the weight of ancient tradition. Caleb couldn't understand the words, but he felt the power behind them, a calling upon spirits and ancestors to witness what was about to unfold. Chief Spotted Eagle spoke first, recounting the crimes of the slavers in both Pawnee and English, so that everyone present could understand. He described the network of caves where people had been chained, the sales to mining companies that worked their victims to death, and the corruption that had allowed the operation to continue for so long. "These men have violated the most sacred law," the chief declared. "They have stolen the freedom that the Great Spirit gave to all people. They have turned human beings into property, souls into merchandise. There can be no mercy for such crimes." When given the chance to speak, Kruger made a desperate attempt to save his life by providing detailed information about his operation. He named names, revealed locations, and described the full scope of the slavery network with the panicked urgency of a man who knew confession was his only hope. "There are 7 more caves," he said, his voice shaking. 2 in the Sangre de Cristo Range, 3 in the Sawatch Mountains, and 2 more north of here in the Rockies. "We got maybe 30 people chained up right now, waiting for buyers." The revelation sent a ripple of anger through the assembled Pawnee. 30 people, men, women, possibly children, were still suffering in the darkness while their captors waited for the highest bidder. Kruger continued his confession, desperate to provide enough information to buy his life. "Judge Morrison. In Denver, he's been taking money to dismiss charges. Captain Hayes at Fort Collins, he gives us information about troop movements. The Morrison Mine Company, they've bought at least 40 people from us in the past year." Chief Spotted Eagle listened to every word with the patience of a man who understood the value of information. When Kruger finished, the chief turned to his council of elders for their judgment. The deliberation was conducted in Pawnee, with the elders speaking in turns while the rest of the camp listened in respectful silence. Caleb found himself studying the faces around the fire, seeing the mixture of anger, sadness, and determination that defined a people who had suffered too much but refused to surrender. Finally, the eldest member of the council stood to deliver the verdict. He was a man of perhaps 70 winters, his face deeply lined and his hair white as snow, but his voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "We have heard the crimes of these men," he said in heavily accented English. "We have heard their words of regret, spoken only when death approaches. The Great Spirit teaches us that all life is sacred, but these men have forgotten this teaching. They have made themselves enemies of all living things." The elder's gaze fixed on Kruger, who was now trembling with fear. "You will die at sunrise, but your death will serve a greater purpose. The information you have given us will be used to free the people you have enslaved. Your crimes will end with your life." Kruger began to sob, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Please, I can help you. I know where everyone is. I can make this right." "You cannot make right what you have done," Chief Spotted Eagle replied. "But your death will prevent you from doing more evil, and the knowledge you have shared will help us save others." As the council fire burned lower and the camp prepared for the night, Caleb found himself grappling with what he had witnessed. The Pawnee justice was harsh but fair, driven by a moral code that valued human dignity above all else. It was different from the white man's law, but in many ways more honest about the nature of good and evil. Natawa found him sitting apart from the others, staring into the dying flames. "You are troubled," she observed, settling beside him. "On the ground, I've seen men die before," Caleb said quietly. "I've killed men myself, but this feels different somehow, because this is justice, not war," Natawa replied. "In war, men die for causes they may not understand. Here, a man dies because he chose to be evil when he could have chosen to be good." Caleb nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about those 30 people still chained in caves. While we sit here, talking, they're suffering in the dark, not knowing if anyone will ever find them." "Then we must find them," Natawa said simply. "My uncle has already decided to organize rescue parties. The question is whether you will join us." Kruger's execution took place at sunrise, conducted with the same ceremony that had marked his trial. The slaver faced his death with the cowardice that had characterized his life, begging for mercy. Until the very end. His death was quick, but witnessed by the entire camp as a reminder that evil actions have consequences. Caleb watched the execution with mixed feelings. He felt no sympathy for Kruger, who had chosen his path and paid the price for it. But he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with witnessing justice. The knowledge of the remaining slavery network meant that the work was far from over. Chief Spotted Eagle approached him after the ceremony. "You have seen our way of justice," he said. "Do you still wish to ride with us?" "More than ever," Caleb replied. "Those people in the caves deserve to be free. If I can help make that happen, then I will." The chief nodded approvingly. "Then, you are truly our brother in war. But know this, the path ahead will be dangerous. We will face not just slavers, but corrupt officials and possibly even military forces. Are you prepared for such a fight?" Caleb thought about his ranch, his solitary life, and the ghosts that had haunted him for 15 years. Then he looked at Natawa, whose strength had shown him that redemption was possible, and at the Pawnee warriors who had accepted him as one of their own. "I've been running from fights my whole life," he said. "It's time I ran toward one instead." 3 days after Kruger's execution, Chief Spotted Eagle gathered his most trusted warriors around a detailed map carved into a large piece of bark. The information extracted from the dead slaver had provided precise locations of the remaining caves, but liberating 30 captives from 7 different locations would require military precision and careful coordination. "We cannot attack all caves at once," the chief explained, using small stones to mark each location on the map. "We do not have enough warriors, and if we fail at one location, word will spread to the others. The slavers will kill their prisoners rather than lose their investment." Swift Arrow, the young warrior who had befriended Caleb, studied the map intently. "The caves in the Sangre de Cristo range are closest to our camp. We could strike there. First, free those captives, then move on to the others. Natoa, who had insisted on participating despite her recent ordeal, pointed to a location north of their current position. This cave near Crystal Creek, I heard the slavers talking about it. They said it held mostly women and children taken from Cherokee settlements. If we move quickly, we could reach it before they expect any trouble. Caleb found himself studying the tactical situation with the analytical mind he had developed during his military service. The problem isn't just freeing the captives, he said. It's getting them to safety afterward. These people will be weak, possibly injured, and certainly traumatized. We need to plan for medical care and transportation. Chief Spotted Eagle nodded approvingly. The white soldier thinks like a warrior. This is good. We will need supply caches, safe houses, and routes that avoid areas where corrupt officials might intercept us. The war party that departed the Pawnee camp consisted of 8 warriors, Caleb and Natoa, who had convinced her uncle that her knowledge of the slavers' methods would be invaluable. They traveled light and fast, carrying only essential weapons and supplies, moving through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain men. The journey to Crystal Creek took 2 days of hard riding through high mountain passes and dense forest. Caleb found himself impressed by the Pawnee warriors' knowledge of the land. They seemed to know every game trail, every water source, every hidden valley that could provide shelter or concealment. My grandfather hunted these mountains before. The white man came, explained a warrior named Bear Claw as they made camp on the first night. He taught my father, who taught me. The land remembers those who respect it. As they approached their target, the party split into 2 groups. Chief Spotted Eagle would lead the main assault on the cave entrance, while Caleb and 3 warriors would circle around to block any escape routes. The plan was simple but effective: overwhelm the guards quickly and quietly, then evacuate the prisoners before reinforcements could arrive. The Crystal Creek cave was hidden in a narrow gorge that could only be accessed by a treacherous path along the creek bed. 2 guards sat at the entrance, their attention focused on a card game rather than watching for threats. Their casual attitude spoke of men who had grown complacent after months of operating without interference. The attack came at dawn, swift and silent as death itself. Bear Claw's arrow took the first guard through the throat he could cry out, while Swift Arrow's war club crushed the skull of the second man. Within seconds, the entrance was secured without a single shot being fired. Inside the cave, the scene was even more horrifying than Caleb had imagined. 12 people, 8 women, and 4 children were chained to the walls in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for animals. The stench of human waste and unwashed bodies filled the air, while the captives' hollow eyes spoke of suffering that went beyond physical pain. We're here to free you, Nitawa said in Cherokee, her voice gentle but urgent. You're going to be safe now. The prisoners' initial reaction was disbelief mixed with terror. They had been broken by their captivity, reduced to a state where they feared any change might make their situation worse. It took precious minutes to convince them that the rescue was real and not some cruel trick by their captors. While the warriors worked to break the chains, Caleb and Chief Spotted Eagle conducted a quick search of the cave. They found ledgers detailing the sale of previous captives, correspondence with mining companies, and most damning of all, a list of corrupt officials who had been paid to facilitate the operation. Judge Morrison in Denver. Caleb read from one letter. Captain Hayes at Fort Collins. Sheriff Daniels in Pueblo. The corruption goes all the way to the territorial capital. Among the freed captives was an elderly Cherokee woman named Ayana, who despite her obvious weakness had somehow maintained her dignity and spirit. She approached Chief Spotted Eagle with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. I am Ayana, grandmother of the Wolf clan, she said in carefully pronounced English. These children are under my protection. I thank you for our freedom. But many more suffer in other places, As the rescued captives were prepared for transportation to safety, Ayanna provided crucial information about the larger slavery network. Her keen observations during captivity had revealed details that even Kruger's confession had missed. "The man who leads this evil business is not dead," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Kruger was just one of his lieutenants. The real leader is called Morrison, not the judge, but a man who uses that name to hide his true identity." This revelation sent shockwaves through the war party. If Kruger had been merely a subordinate, then the network was far larger and more dangerous than anyone had suspected. The true leader was still alive and would undoubtedly reorganize the operation to continue the slave trade. "Morrison has connections in Washington," Ayanna continued. "I heard him talking to visitors about government contracts, about supplying workers to railroad projects and mining operations across the territory. This is not just local crime, it reaches the highest levels of power." Chief Spotted Eagle's expression hardened as he processed this information. "Then we are not just fighting criminals. We are fighting corruption that has infected the white man's government itself." The evacuation of the Crystal Creek prisoners required careful planning and execution. The rescued captives were too weak to travel quickly, and several of the children were suffering from malnutrition and exposure. Caleb found himself drawing on his military medical training to provide basic care for the most seriously injured. The war party established a temporary camp in a hidden valley while they decided on their next move. The original plan had been to strike the remaining caves in rapid succession, but the presence of weakened captives complicated everything. They needed to get these people to safety before continuing their liberation campaign. "There is a mission station 2 days' ride south," Chief Spotted Eagle said after consulting with his warriors. "The priest there is an honest man who has helped our people before. He will care for the rescued ones while we continue our work." The journey to the mission proved more challenging than expected. On the second day, they encountered a patrol of territorial militia that appeared to be searching for something or someone. The soldiers were too far away to pose an immediate threat, but their presence suggested that news of the rescue had somehow reached the authorities. "They know," Natoa said quietly, watching the distant riders through Caleb's spyglass. "Someone has told them about the attack on the cave." Chief Spotted Eagle made a quick decision. "We split up. Half the warriors take the rescued ones to the mission by the mountain route. The rest of us will lead the soldiers away from them." The territorial militia patrol consisted of 12 men under the command of a captain who introduced himself as Thomas Blake, but something about the officer's manner and the condition of his men suggested this was no ordinary military unit. When the patrol intercepted the Pawnee war party, Blake's first words revealed the true nature of the situation. "You're interfering with legitimate business operations," he said, his hand resting on his pistol. "Those Indians you freed are escaped reservation prisoners. They need to be returned to proper custody." Caleb studied the militia captain with growing suspicion. Blake's uniform was non-regulation, his men were poorly disciplined, and several of them bore the hard faces of men who had lived outside the law. This wasn't a legitimate military unit. It was a private army hired to protect the slavery network. "Proper custody?" Chief Spotted Eagle replied, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. "You mean chains in dark caves, sold to mine owners like cattle?" Blake's facade of official authority cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about, Indian. I'm here under orders from the territorial governor to round up reservation jumpers and return them to their assigned lands." The confrontation that followed was brief but violent. When Blake made the mistake of drawing his weapon, swift arrows, Tomahawk split his skull before he could fire a shot. The corrupt militiamen, caught off guard by the sudden attack, found themselves facing warriors who had been trained for this kind of close-quarters combat. What followed was a running battle through the narrow valley, with the Pawnee warriors using their superior knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect. The militiamen had better weapons, but lacked the skill and coordination of their opponents. Caleb found himself fighting alongside Bear Claw against 3 militiamen who had taken cover behind a fallen log. His Winchester rifle proved effective at medium range, while Bear Claw's war club was devastating in close combat. The partnership between White Rancher and Pawnee warrior was seamless, each man covering the other's weaknesses. "Behind you!" Caleb shouted, and Bear Claw spun to face a militiaman who had been attempting to flank them. The warrior's tomahawk caught the man in the chest, dropping him instantly. The battle ended when the surviving militiamen attempted to retreat and found their path blocked by Chief Spotted Eagle and 2 warriors who had circled around behind them. Faced with certain death, the remaining soldiers surrendered. The captured militiamen provided disturbing information about the extent of the corruption. They confirmed that the slavery network extended throughout the territory, with officials at every level taking bribes to look the other way. The territorial governor himself was rumored to be involved. Though the militiamen had no direct evidence, "Morrison pays us good money to keep folks from asking questions," one prisoner admitted. "He's got judges, sheriffs, army officers, even some federal marshals on his payroll. Anyone who gets too curious tends to have accidents." The scope of the corruption was staggering. The slavery network wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a shadow government that had infiltrated legitimate authority at every level. Fighting it would require more than military action. It would require a complete exposure of the conspiracy. "We need to get word to Washington," Caleb said after hearing the confessions. "There must be honest officials somewhere who would act on this information." Chief Spotted Eagle shook his head grimly. "The white man's government is like a tree with rotten roots. Cut off one branch and 2 more grow in its place. The only way to kill corruption is to destroy it completely." As they prepared to continue their liberation campaign, Caleb found himself grappling with a fundamental question about the nature of justice. The Pawnee way was direct and uncompromising. Corruption was met with death, evil with violence. But Caleb's military training had taught him to work within established systems, to follow chains of command and legal procedures. "Your white man's law has failed," Natawa said when he expressed his concerns. "It failed to protect innocent people, failed to punish the guilty, failed to stop the spread of evil. Sometimes the only justice is the justice you make yourself." The rescued Cherokee grandmother, Ayana, offered a different perspective. "The spirits of the ancestors watch over us," she said. "They see the suffering of their children and demand that it be ended. Whether that ending comes through white law or Indian justice matters less than the fact that it comes." With the Pavav militia threat eliminated and the first group of captives safely delivered to the mission, the war party turned their attention to the next target, a cave complex in the Sawatch Mountains that reportedly held 10 prisoners, including several children from Apache settlements. The approach to this location was more challenging, requiring the party to cross several mountain passes that were already showing signs of early winter weather. Snow fell steadily as they climbed higher, and the temperature dropped to levels that made camping uncomfortable and travel dangerous. "The weather works for us," Chief Spotted Eagle observed as they prepared for the assault. "The guards will be focused on staying warm rather than watching for attacks. Cold makes men careless." The cave complex proved to be more heavily defended than Crystal Creek, with 4 guards and a more sophisticated alarm system. But the defenders were unprepared for an attack in a snowstorm, and their visibility was severely limited by the weather. The attack came during the worst of the storm, when visibility was reduced to mere yards and the howling wind masked any sound of approach. The Pawnee warriors moved like ghosts through the swirling snow, their dark clothing making them nearly invisible against the rocky terrain. Caleb and Swift Arrow took the guards at the cave entrance, while Chief Spotted Eagle led the main assault. On the interior defenses, the storm provided perfect cover for their movements, and the guards were eliminated before they could raise an alarm. Inside the cave, they found conditions even worse than at Crystal Creek. The prisoners had been given minimal food and no protection from the cold, and several of the children were showing signs of severe illness. One small Apache boy appeared to be dying from pneumonia. "We need to get them to warmth immediately," Caleb said, his medical training taking over. "Some of these people won't survive another night in these conditions." The evacuation was complicated by the storm, but the warriors worked with desperate efficiency to get the prisoners to safety. The dying child was wrapped in furs and carried by Bear Claw, who seemed to understand that every minute counted. As word of the rescues spread through the territory, the slavery network began to react with increasing desperation. Corrupt officials who had been paid to look the other way now found themselves facing exposure, and they began to take more active measures to protect their investment. A bounty was placed on Chief Spotted Eagle's head, and wanted posters appeared in towns throughout the territory. The reward was substantial enough to attract bounty hunters and mercenaries from across the West, but the Pawnee chief was undeterred. "Let them come," he said as they prepared for the next rescue mission. "The spirits of our ancestors fight beside us, and no amount of white man's gold can buy victory over righteousness." The war party had grown as well, with warriors from other tribes joining the liberation campaign. Cherokee, Apache, and even some Ute warriors had pledged their support, creating a multi-tribal alliance that the authorities had never faced before. Caleb found himself at the center of this growing resistance, his military experience making him valuable as a tactical advisor. But more than that, his presence as a white man fighting alongside Native Americans sent a powerful message about the moral clarity of their cause. "You have chosen sides," Nitawa told him as they prepared for the next mission. "There is no going back to your quiet ranch life now." "I know," Caleb replied, checking his rifle one final time. "And I'm glad. For the first time in 15 years, I'm fighting for something that matters." 2 weeks after the snowstorm rescue, the multi-tribal alliance found itself facing a new and deadly threat. Professional bounty hunters from across the Western territories had converged on Colorado, drawn by the substantial reward placed on Chief Spotted Eagle's head and the promise of easy money from capturing renegade Indians. The most dangerous of these hunters was a man known only as the Preacher, a former Confederate cavalry officer who had turned to bounty hunting after the war. He traveled with a crew of 12 hardened killers, each one skilled in tracking and warfare. Unlike the corrupt militia they had faced before, these men were professionals who understood the value of patience and planning. "They're not like the others," Bear Claw reported after returning from a scouting mission. "They move like soldiers, set proper camps, post guards. Their leader studies the ground like he's reading a book." The Preacher had been tracking the alliance for 5 days, learning their patterns and habits with the methodical precision of a man who had spent years hunting human prey. His strategy was simple but effective: force the alliance into a defensive position, then use superior firepower to overwhelm them. Chief Spotted Eagle recognized the danger immediately. "This man understands war," he said after studying the tracks Bear Claw had found. "He will not attack until he is certain of victory. We must force him to fight on our terms, not his." The Alliance's response was to set a trap of their own. Devil's Canyon was a narrow gorge with steep walls, and only one way in or out, perfect for an ambush if properly prepared. The plan was to make it appear that the Alliance had been cornered, then turn the tables when the Preacher's men entered the canyon. Caleb found himself assigned to a crucial role in the ambush. His knowledge of explosives from his military days would be used to create a rock slide that would block the canyon entrance, trapping the bounty hunters inside where the Alliance's superior knowledge of the terrain would give them the advantage. "The charges must be placed perfectly," Chief Spotted Eagle explained as they prepared the trap. "Too small and the entrance remains open. Too large and the entire canyon becomes a tomb for us all." The work was dangerous and required absolute Precision. Caleb spent hours calculating the exact placement of black powder charges, using his engineering knowledge to ensure the rock slide would create a barrier without bringing down the entire cliff face. Natawa worked alongside him, her small size allowing her to reach crevices in the rock that would be impossible for larger men. "You trust me with your life," she observed as she placed a particularly delicate charge. "I've trusted you with." "More than that," Caleb replied, checking the fuses one final time. "You've helped me find my way back to being the man I was meant to be." The preacher took the bait exactly as the Alliance had hoped. His scouts reported that the renegade Indians had fled into Devil's Canyon with no apparent way out, creating what appeared to be a perfect opportunity for a decisive strike. The bounty hunters entered the canyon in military formation, with the preacher leading the main group while his lieutenant took a smaller force around the rim to prevent any escape attempts. It was a sound tactical plan that would have worked against most opponents, but the preacher had underestimated both the Alliance's preparation and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the greater cause. Hidden warriors watched from concealed positions as the bounty hunters advanced deeper into the canyon, waiting for the signal to spring their trap. "Now," Chief Spotted Eagle whispered, and Caleb triggered the explosive charges. The rock slide was spectacular and terrifying. Tons of stone cascading down the canyon walls to seal the entrance with a barrier 20 feet high. The thunderous roar echoed off the canyon walls, and dust filled the air like fog. The preacher's men found themselves trapped in a stone prison with nowhere to run. Their superior numbers and firepower counted for nothing in the confined space, while the Alliance warriors picked them off from hidden positions among the rocks. As his men fell around him, the preacher proved why he had earned his fearsome reputation. Instead of panicking, he organized his remaining forces into a defensive position and began a systematic counterattack that showed his military training. "He's good," Swift Arrow admitted grudgingly as a well-placed shot from the preacher's rifle barely missed his head. "He fights like a warrior even when he knows he's going to die." The battle in the canyon became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with both sides using every available piece of cover to avoid enemy fire. The Alliance held the advantage of position and numbers, but the preacher's men were skilled marksmen who made every shot count. Caleb found himself facing the preacher directly when the bounty hunter attempted to reach higher ground for a better firing position. The two men were similar in age and military background, but they had chosen very different paths in life. "You're fighting for the wrong side, soldier," the preacher called out during a lull in the shooting. "These savages will turn on you the moment you're no longer useful." "I'm fighting for people who treat me like family," Caleb replied, adjusting his position behind a boulder. "You're fighting for money. Which one of us is really the savage?" The final phase of the battle demonstrated the strength of the alliance that had formed between the various tribes and Caleb. Warriors who had been enemies for generations now fought side by side, their ancient rivalries forgotten in the face of a common threat. Cherokee warriors provided covering fire while Apache scouts flanked the bounty hunters' positions. Pawnee braves charged with traditional weapons while Ute marksmen picked off targets from long range. The coordination was seamless, born of mutual respect and shared purpose. Caleb found himself at the center of this brotherhood, his white skin no longer marking him as an outsider, but as a brother who had proven himself in battle. When a bounty hunter's bullet grazed his shoulder, Bear Claw risked his own life to drag him to safety. "Brother protects brother," the warrior said simply, binding Caleb's wound with practiced efficiency. Color of skin means nothing. Color of heart means everything. The bonds forged in combat were stronger than any treaty or formal agreement. These men had bled together, fought together, and faced death together. They were no longer separate tribes allied by necessity. They were one people united by choice. As the preacher lay dying from wounds suffered in the final assault, he made a confession that changed everything the Alliance thought they knew about their enemies. With his last breath, he revealed that the slavery network was just one part of a much larger conspiracy. Morrison isn't just selling Indians, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. He's planning something bigger. Government. Contracts, railroad deals, mining rights. The whole territory is for sale to the highest bidder. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Alliance leadership. If the preacher was telling the truth, then the corruption extended far beyond the slavery network. It was a conspiracy to control the entire economic and political structure of the Colorado Territory. Chief Spotted Eagle knelt beside the dying bounty hunter, his expression grave. Where can we find Morrison? How do we stop what he's planning? Denver, the preacher gasped. Big meeting next week. All the corrupt officials, mining companies, railroad executives. They're dividing up the territory like pieces of a pie. Among the preacher's possessions, the Alliance found a treasure trove of information about the corruption network. Letters from government officials, contracts with mining companies, and most damning of all, a detailed plan for the systematic seizure of Native American lands throughout the territory. The documents revealed that the slavery operation had been designed to accomplish two goals: provide cheap labor for industrial operations and create pretexts for military action against hostile tribes. Every escape attempt, every rescue mission, every act of resistance had been used to justify increased government intervention. They wanted us to fight back, Natoa said as she studied the papers. Our rescue missions gave them excuses to declare martial law, to bring in more troops, to claim that all Indians were dangerous. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Corrupt officials had been systematically appointed to key positions throughout the territory. Mining companies had been given illegal access to sacred lands. Railroad companies had been granted rights of way through reservation boundaries. The entire governmental structure had been compromised. Caleb found himself looking at documents that named specific individuals he had known during his military service. Officers he had respected, politicians he had voted for, businessmen he had considered pillars of the community, all of them were part of the conspiracy. We can't fight this with war parties and rescue missions, he said after reviewing the evidence. This requires a different kind of battle. The Alliance faced a crucial decision. They could continue their liberation campaign, freeing the remaining captives from the scattered caves, or they could strike at the heart of the conspiracy by disrupting the Denver meeting. They didn't have the resources to do both, Chief Spotted Eagle called for a council of war that included representatives from all the participating tribes. The debate was intense, with valid arguments on both sides. Some warriors wanted to continue rescuing their people, while others believed that stopping the conspiracy was more important. If we save 30 people but allow the conspiracy to succeed, thousands more will suffer, argued an Apache war chief named Red Hawk. Better to strike at the root of the evil than to trim its branches. But if we abandon our people in the caves, we become no better than the white devils who chained them there, countered a Cherokee elder. A warrior's first duty is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The deadlock was broken by an unexpected voice. Ayanna, the Cherokee grandmother they had rescued from Crystal Creek, spoke with the authority of someone who had survived the worst the conspiracy had to offer. I have been chained in darkness, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the veil. Mountain air. I have watched children die from neglect and cruelty, but I have also seen the documents you captured. If this meeting in Denver succeeds, no Native American will be safe anywhere in the territory. The decision was made to split their forces. A small group would continue the rescue operations while the main force would travel to Denver to disrupt the conspiracy meeting. It was a dangerous gamble that would stretch their resources to the breaking point. Caleb volunteered to lead the Denver mission, his knowledge of white society and military tactics making him the logical choice. But Chief Spotted Eagle insisted on coming as well. Despite the danger his presence would create, this is not just about strategy, the chief explained. My people need to see that their leader stands with them, even in the heart of enemy territory. Courage is not something you can delegate. The journey to Denver required careful planning and disguise. The Alliance members would have to blend into white society, something that would be nearly impossible for most of the warriors. But Caleb had an idea that might work. "We don't try to hide," he said as they prepared for the mission. "We go as what we are, a delegation of concerned citizens investigating territorial corruption. Sometimes the best disguise is the truth." As the Alliance prepared for what might be their final mission, each member faced the possibility that they might not survive the confrontation in Denver. The conspiracy had resource and connections that dwarfed anything they could bring to bear. But they also had something their enemies lacked, the moral clarity that comes from fighting for justice rather than profit. They knew that their cause was righteous, that they were protecting innocent people from those who would exploit them. Netawa found Caleb preparing his weapons with the methodical care of a man who expected to use them. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "But not of dying. I'm afraid of failing, of letting down the people who trusted me. I've failed before, and I know what it costs. You're not the same man who failed at Bent's Creek," she replied. That man was confused, following orders he didn't understand. This man knows exactly what he's fighting for. The Alliance had become more than a military force. It had become a family bound together by shared sacrifice and common purpose. Whatever happened in Denver, they would face it together. As they prepared to leave for the territorial capital, Chief Spotted Eagle offered a prayer to the spirits of their ancestors. "Guide our steps," he said, his voice carrying across the mountain valley. "Give us strength to face our enemies and wisdom to know when mercy is possible." The final battle was approaching, and everyone knew that the fate of thousands hung in the balance. But for the first time since the campaign began, Caleb felt genuinely hopeful. They had the evidence, they had the courage, and most importantly, they had each other. Denver in October 1878 was a city caught between two worlds, the rough frontier settlement it had been and the sophisticated capital it aspired to become. The streets bustled with miners, ranchers, businessmen, and politicians, all drawn by the promise of wealth and power in the expanding territory. Into this maze of ambition and corruption, the Alliance members arrived in small groups, each playing a carefully rehearsed role. Caleb entered the city as a prospective investor interested in mining opportunities, his military bearing and obvious wealth making him welcome in the circles where the conspiracy's members gathered. Chief Spotted Eagle had reluctantly agreed to remain hidden in the mountains, his distinctive appearance making it impossible for him to blend into white society. Netawa proved to be a master of disguise, transforming herself into a well-dressed Mexican woman named Maria Santos, supposedly the widow of a wealthy rancher, seeking to invest her late husband's fortune. Her natural intelligence and quick wit made her convincing in the role, while her knowledge of the conspiracy's operations made her invaluable as a spy. The other Alliance members took positions throughout the city, some as servants in the hotel where the meeting would take place, others as stable hands and drivers who could observe the comings and goings of the conspirators. It was a complex operation that required perfect timing and absolute discipline. The Grand Mountain Hotel was Denver's finest establishment, a 4-story brick building that catered to the territory's elite. The conspiracy meeting was scheduled to take place in the hotel's largest conference room, with security provided by corrupt territorial marshals who had been paid to ensure privacy. As the Alliance members took their positions, they began to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. The corruption extended far beyond what they had imagined, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government and involving some of the most powerful men in the region. Judge Morrison, the territorial Supreme Court justice, was indeed involved, but he was merely one player in a much larger game. The real power behind the conspiracy was a consortium of Eastern businessmen led by railroad magnate Cornelius Ashford, who saw the Colorado Territory as a vast source of untapped wealth. They're not just stealing land, Nitoa reported after eavesdropping on a conversation between two mining executives. They're planning to control every aspect of the territory's economy. Mining rights, railroad routes, water rights, timber leases, everything will be owned by this consortium. The slavery network had been just one part of this larger plan. By creating artificial labor shortages through the capture and sale of Native Americans, the conspirators had driven up wages and made their own operations more profitable. The rescued captives were not just victims of individual cruelty. They were casualties of systematic economic warfare. Caleb discovered that the conspiracy had been years in the making, with agents planted throughout the territorial government from the very beginning. Elections had been manipulated, appointments had been bought, and anyone who threatened to expose the corruption had been eliminated. "We're not just fighting criminals," he told Bearclaw during a clandestine meeting. "We're fighting a shadow government that's been operating parallel to the official one for years." The morning of the crucial meeting dawned clear and cold, with the first snow of winter dusting the peaks surrounding Denver. The Grand Mountain Hotel buzzed with activity as powerful men from across the territory converged for what they believed would be the final division of Colorado's wealth. From his position in the hotel's main lobby, Caleb watched the conspirators arrive. Judge Morrison came first, followed by Captain Hayes from Fort Collins and Sheriff Daniels from Pueblo. Behind them came the businessmen, mining executives, railroad officials, and land speculators who had traveled from as far away as New York and Chicago. The most impressive arrival was Cornelius Ashford himself, a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute power. His entourage included private security guards, legal advisors, and what appeared to be a territorial militia captain who had been bought and paid for. "He looks like a king surveying his kingdom," Bearclaw observed from his position as a hotel porter. But kings can fall like any other man. The security around the meeting was impressive, but not impenetrable. The conspirators had grown overconfident after years of operating without interference, and they had not anticipated the kind of coordinated assault the Alliance was planning. The meeting began at 10 o'clock in the morning, with the conspirators gathering in the hotel's ornate conference room. Through carefully positioned listening posts, the Alliance members were able to hear every word of the proceedings. Ashford opened the meeting with a speech that revealed the breathtaking scope of their plans. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "today we complete the transformation of the Colorado Territory into the most profitable region in the American West." The railroad magnate outlined a plan that would systematically strip the territory of its resources while enriching the consortium members. Native American lands would be seized through manufactured conflicts, mining rights would be granted to companies owned by the conspirators, and the territorial government would be restructured to serve their interests. The remaining Indian troublemakers will be eliminated, Ashford continued, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "Our recent setbacks with the rescue operations have been costly, but they have also provided us with justification for more aggressive action." Judge Morrison stood to address the group, his judicial robes lending false legitimacy to the proceedings. "I have prepared legal documentation that will allow us to declare martial law throughout the territory. Any resistance to our operations will be classified as insurrection and dealt with accordingly." The plans were even more horrifying than the Alliance had imagined. The conspirators intended to use the rescue operations as pretext for a campaign of genocide that would eliminate Native Americans from the territory entirely. At precisely noon, as the conspirators paused their meeting for lunch, the Alliance put their plan into action. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, with Alliance members positioned throughout the hotel coordinating their assault with military precision. Caleb and 3 warriors burst through the conference room doors just as the conspirators were beginning to discuss the specific military actions they would take against the tribes. The shock on their faces was complete. They had believed themselves to be untouchable, surrounded by loyal guards and protected by their wealth and political connections. "Gentlemen," Caleb announced, his Winchester rifle trained on Ashford, "this meeting is over. You're all under citizen's arrest for conspiracy, slavery, and treason against the United States." The conspirators' initial reaction was disbelief mixed with outrage. Judge Morrison sputtered protests about jurisdiction and proper authority, while Captain Hayes reached for his sidearm only to find Bear Claw's tomahawk at his throat. "You have no authority here," Ashford shouted, his composure finally cracking. "I own half the politicians in Washington. You're just a bunch of savage Indians and a washed-up soldier." "Maybe," Caleb replied, producing the documents they had captured from the preacher and Kruger. "But we have evidence of every crime you've committed, every official you've bribed, and every innocent person you've killed." What followed was a tense standoff as the conspirators realized that their carefully constructed world was collapsing around them. The Alliance held the physical advantage, controlling the room and its exits, but the conspirators still had resources and connections that could not be easily overcome. The situation became more complex when territorial marshals arrived at the hotel, responding to reports of Indian raiders attacking prominent citizens. But these were not the corrupt lawmen the conspirators had been expecting. They were honest officers who had been investigating the corruption network independently. Marshal James Crawford had been tracking the slavery network for months, gathering evidence and building cases against the corrupt officials. The Alliance's rescue operations had actually helped his investigation by forcing the conspirators to reveal themselves through their reactions. "I've been wondering when someone would have the courage to confront these criminals directly," Crawford said as he surveyed the scene. "I just didn't expect it to be a group of tribal warriors and a rancher." The arrival of legitimate law enforcement changed the dynamic completely. The conspirators could no longer rely on their corrupt connections to protect them, and the evidence the Alliance had gathered provided the legal foundation for prosecuting their crimes. As the net closed around the conspiracy, Ashford made a desperate attempt to escape. The railroad magnate had not achieved his position through cowardice, and he was not about to surrender without a fight. Drawing a concealed derringer, he attempted to shoot his way out of the hotel. The gun battle that followed was brief but intense. Ashford's private security guards, realizing that their employer's arrest would end their lucrative employment, fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, but they were facing opponents who had been forged in the crucible of guerrilla warfare. The Alliance warriors moved with the fluid coordination of men who had learned to fight as one unit, while Caleb's military training allowed him to anticipate and counter the guards' tactics. The fight ended when Nitawa, still disguised as Maria Santos, managed to disarm Judge Morrison and use his own weapon against Ashford's remaining guards. Her shot was precise and deadly, dropping the last guard before he could fire on Bear Claw. "It's over," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting for too long. "No more running, no more hiding. Justice has finally caught up with you." The collapse of the conspiracy sent shockwaves throughout the Colorado Territory and beyond. The evidence gathered by the Alliance led to arrests in multiple states, as the corruption network was exposed and dismantled piece by piece. Judge Morrison was stripped of his position and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Captain Hayes was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. Sheriff Daniels and dozens of other corrupt officials found themselves facing criminal charges that would end their careers and their freedom. But the most significant victory was the systematic liberation of the remaining captives from the slavery network. With the conspiracy's leadership eliminated and their corrupt protectors arrested, the remaining caves were located and their prisoners freed. The multi-tribal alliance that had formed to fight the conspiracy did not dissolve with their victory. Instead, it evolved into something unprecedented, a permanent coalition of tribes working together to protect their people and their rights. Chief Spotted Eagle became the recognized leader of this new alliance, his wisdom and courage earning him respect from tribes that had been enemies for generations. The coalition established a system of mutual defense that would protect Native Americans throughout the territory. For Caleb Stone, the campaign had been more than a military victory. It had been a spiritual transformation. The isolated rancher who had fled from his past had become a leader who helped others find their future. His ranch in Shadow Valley became a meeting place for the Alliance, a neutral ground where representatives from different tribes could gather to discuss common problems and coordinate their responses. The solitary hermit had become the center of a community. "You found your way home," Natawa told him as they stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Not to a place, but to a purpose. The ghosts that had haunted Caleb for 15 years had not disappeared, but they had been transformed from sources of guilt into reminders of the importance of choosing the right side in the struggle between good and evil. "I can't change what I did at Bent's Creek," he said, "but I can make sure that nothing like it happens again." That's not redemption, but it's a start. As winter settled over the Colorado Territory, the Alliance prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. The conspiracy had been defeated, but the conditions that had allowed it to flourish remained poverty, prejudice, and the endless hunger for profit that drove men to commit atrocities. The rescued captives were slowly rebuilding their lives, supported by the Alliance and protected by the new system of mutual defense. Children who had been traumatized by captivity were learning to trust again, while adults who had lost hope were discovering new reasons to live. Ayana, the Cherokee grandmother who had become a symbol of survival and resilience, established a school where Alliance children could learn both traditional ways and the skills needed to navigate the modern world. "We must remember where we came from," she told her students, "but we must also prepare for where we are going. The future belongs to those who can honor the past while embracing change." The Alliance's victory had implications far beyond the Colorado Territory. Word of the multi-tribal cooperation spread to reservations throughout the West, inspiring other groups to organize and defend themselves against exploitation and oppression. Years later, when historians would write about the Colorado Territory's transformation from a center of corruption to a model of justice, they would struggle to explain how a small group of tribal warriors and a solitary rancher had accomplished what the federal government had failed to do. The answer lay not in superior numbers or better weapons, but in the power of people who fought for something greater than themselves. The Alliance had succeeded because they understood that justice was not just about punishing the guilty, it was about protecting the innocent and building a better future for all. Caleb Stone's ranch in Shadow Valley became a symbol of that transformation, a place where former enemies had learned to work together and where the promise of redemption was available to anyone willing to fight for it. The Bat Cave where Natawa had been chained became a memorial to those who had suffered under the slavery network, but also a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope could survive and eventually triumph. As the sun set on their story, Caleb and Natawa stood together on the porch of the ranch house, surrounded by the family they had chosen and the community they had helped to build. The lonely rancher had found his Pawnee girl chained in a cave, but together they had discovered something far more valuable than freedom. They had found purpose, justice, and the knowledge that no one fights alone when they fight for what is right. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to the transformation that had taken place in Shadow Valley. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and the promise of tomorrow stretched out before them like the endless Colorado sky.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.